maybe was a little bit better, the Silver Surfer movie. I think we can all agree nobody seemed to like the Fantastic Four movie that came out a year or two ago. But back to the comics, it was in the page of the Fantastic Four that Kirby, with editor and dialoguer Stan Lee, ended up creating the Marvel Universe as we know it today. The first character they bring back from the 40s is Submariner, and there is a Jack Kirby version. Of course, who does he resemble later on in the 60s? Absolutely, you can't tell me that that is not the Submariner's whole look brought to television. Then in issue 5, they debut Dr. Doom, the ultimate villain of the Marvel Universe. That's the way he looked on the first cover. The more mature Dr. Doom that you're used to, of course, later on in the 60s, Kirby at his peak. And this is an image that had to influence this obscure film villain. Maybe you've heard of him. But yes, George Lucas was a comic fan working in a comic store in the late 60s, and so much of Star Wars, the Force, the Jedi Knights, the relationship, the You Are My Father, all that stuff, all comes out of Kirby's comics, because Lucas was a comic book fan. And there's Dr. Doom from that cover, the annuals. This was where, in 1965, only an artist like Jack Kirby could have drawn this image, basically including every character he either created or co-created on one single cover. And in my book, I take this classic image and I slightly redesign it. Remember I said I put the Thing as the keynote image. That's a sketch that Kirby gave to a student, but Kirby went on record as saying that out of all the characters that he created, the one that he most identifies, that is most like him, that talks like him, moves like him, was the Thing. And that's why that image is there. Then comes the Hulk. Now a lot of people think the Hulk comes out of the whole Jekyll and Hyde thing, but as I tried to tell the story on this double-page spread, Martin Goodman, who was the publisher of Marvel, was very savvy about marketing trends. And in 1961, the biggest selling toy was the first Aurora Monster model, which, because the movies were in black and white, somebody, James Bama, the artist, they decided to paint Frankenstein green. So after the success of the Fantastic Four, and the Thing was the monster character, the most popular, Goodman basically says to Kirby and Lee, can you give me a superhero version of Frankenstein? Well, the reason why the center figure is gray, that's from the first issue, is that Stan Lee probably forgot the dictum that Martin Goodman wanted a superhero Frankenstein. Lee thought, according to what he said, that he thought gray would be a more spookier color for a monster. But Goodman must have flipped his lid when he saw the gray Hulk and said, what happened to my green? Where's my Super Frankenstein? Which is why, starting in issue 2, you get the Green Hulk, and they've never looked back since then. And the Hulk, of course, has gone on to become one of Marvel's key figures, to the point where in the latest Avengers movie, Rolling Stone featured him out of all the superheroes on the cover. Another character with almost as much bulk as the Hulk was that first bulky Iron Man. He starts out gray. What just happened? We got a weak connection or something? What's happening? Why are we losing?
I'm sorry, it's here.
Okay, something just is flickering. What I wanted to say was, I lost my train of thought. Anyway, this is from the origin of Iron Man. In the first movie, they paid homage to the bulky Iron Man, if you recall. But before long, of course, we got the red and yellow Iron Man. But in a sense, it's still derived from a Kirby character. The other popular Marvel movie now, the Captain America movies. Captain America debuts in 1941 when Kirby and his partner Joe Simon were very young. They're working for DC Comics in 1940 on a Boy Commando strip. And then they decide, a year before America enters the war, to come up with a patriotic superhero, Captain America. They were two Jews that wanted to create something to elevate America's consciousness. If you know your history, America was very isolationist. They didn't want to fight what was called Europe's war, and they certainly weren't going to fight a war to save the Jews, if you know your history. So they decided, what can we do? They create Captain America, and Captain America's overnight success. He's really just a 20th century version of Uncle Sam. I mean, I found this image on the internet. I don't know whether it was actually created for the movie. But I like how in the first Captain America movie, they actually paid homage to this, because in real life, Captain America was so successful that they dressed up actors to act as Captain America, and some were war bonds. But just like all the other superheroes, by the end of the war, Captain America had died off. This is his second to last issue, because the horror craze from 1949, and 2 issues later, Captain America was gone. Remember I said that they tried to bring some superheroes back before The Flash in 1956? So Marvel, or as they were known back then, still is, I think, Atlas in the 1950s, they tried to bring Captain America back. That is artwork by the future Spider-Man artist Johnny Romita. But remember I said the key to Flash's success was that they didn't bring the Flash back in the same costume. The reason why this Captain America from 1955 maybe lasted only 3 issues, and you can see they posed him now as a commie smasher. I remember Neil Adams telling me when I worked for him, he goes, Arlen, we were taught to believe that the communists were worse than the Nazis. And that's why Captain America's commie smasher. The success of the Flash, I think, is attributed to the fact that there was something new about him. It was that costume, so it wasn't just taking the 1940s Flash and publishing him in 1956. But it wasn't until this incident in 1963 that so affected Jack Kirby that he felt now is the time to bring Captain America back. Because in the spring of 1964, Captain America does reemerge in the Avengers. He's so successful that by the summer of '64, he's in his own backup series behind. There's one of the few times Kirby returned to Iron Man and drawing him in the red and yellow costume. But it was Captain America that, if the Thing was the character he most identified with, it was Captain America that Kirby said he most enjoyed drawing, because, as you can see on this double-page spread, to Kirby it was all about movement and action. And I take out the original word balloons on the right-hand side. That's Kirby telling you how he designed fight scenes and choreographed them like violent ballets. So you can see, almost like pro football, there's both violence and grace and gymnastics in these incredible images. So powerful that they couldn't help but affect other artists working at other companies, like Gil Kane at DC Comics was trying in Green Lantern to get across that same power as Kirby. 2 years later, he goes to Marvel and draws Captain America and really brings the whole Kirby look full circle. Gil Kane actually worked for Kirby, and Kirby was one of his mentors when he was starting out as a young Jewish artist named Eli Katz, who also changed his name. In this double-page spread, I show you what I just showed you, that path of how Kane went from Captain America. He even says here in the word balloon that he feels he never achieved that Kirby power. But by putting this incredible cover on a full page, I'm basically saying to Gil Kane, hey Gil, I think you're a little hard on yourself. I think you did pretty well. But there's Captain America, so successful when Kirby brings him back that you can see when they went to TV in 1966 that it was Captain America that was positioned as the leader of the Marvel Universe. So successful that within 12 issues he becomes the de facto leader of the Avengers. Well, not de facto, the real leader. And even in this image, though Robert Downey is the more popular actor, you can still see how they position Captain America to still be the leader of the Avengers. How successful have the Marvel superheroes on screen be? As Stan Lee once said, enough said. The other big characters from the Silver Age that have made an impact, of course, in Hollywood have been the X-Men. That's also a Kirby Lee creation. I never put Stan Lee's name first, and that's a whole other story that I'll get into in my Kirby lecture. But in 1963, they do the X-Men. There is their Dr. Doom Magneto, or Magneto. I've always said Magneto, but this is a part of the comic book conversation that's been going on. Submariner, Submariner, right? Anyway, you can see the movies did a pretty good job of translating Kirby's designs. When you look at this image from the first X-Men and you come in close, those of you with sharp, fine art eyes will spot Roy Lichtenstein's famous image duplicator. Lichtenstein would knock off a lot of the Marvel Comics artists, not just Kirby. You can see here what he did with a John Romita image. Comics and pop art were so connected in 1965, the peak year of pop art's original emergence, that for a couple months in mid-65, Stan Lee and Martin Goodman decided to put in their little logo box on the upper left corner the idea that comic books were pop art productions. Now this is the first time Magneto from the Silver Age would be part of the wider pop culture, because in the 70s, Paul McCartney writes the song Magneto and Titanium Man. It's not actually a Jack Kirby image, that's George Tuska kind of knocking off Jack Kirby. Here's a shot from the concert tour in '74 of Paul McCartney and Wings. There's Paul and Linda in the lower right corner. There backstage is McCartney giving, and Linda giving Kirby, one of his heroes, a cake in '74. The Beatles read comics. These are stills from A Hard Day's Night. He's not reading a Marvel comic, he's reading Jimmy Olsen. All the Beatles, most of the original rock and rollers, all went to art school. They were into comics, and don't worry, we didn't leave out Ringo. There's Ringo. Now, if the Beatles were reading comics, you know that meant the Monkees had to be reading comics. But back to not Hard Day's Night. Yeah, Hard Day's Night. No, not Hard Day's Night. Help. These are outtakes, and they're you know, the Beatles couldn't read music, but they certainly read comics. So is it possible that comics were an inspiration for some of the greatest rock and roll ever? I mean, found this on the internet. You gotta love it, where somebody actually sourced out all the DC comics that Lennon has up on his case there. But you've got to look at Lennon and McCartney in the 60s as being as influential to rock and roll as Lee and Kirby were to comics in the 60s. And it's interesting that 3 years before the Beatles came to America, the original title of the Fantastic Four, right before it went to press, was going to be the Fabulous Four. But Martin Goodman thought the title was a little fey, and he had Stan Lee change it. So if Goodman hadn't butted his nose in at the 11th hour, the Fantastic Four would have been the first Fab Four. And that's a spread in my book, and I talk about that. All of the hip people in the 60s, they weren't reading DC Comics. They were reading Kirby's Marvel Comics. They were hipper. They were super anti-heroes. Here's the first major mainstream article about the success of Marvel Comics. In January of '66, a very important week, the same week that the Beatles, the Batman TV show debuted. And then later on that year, in the fall of '66, you get the first mainstream magazine coverage of the success of Marvel Comics, when Esquire magazine does this double-page spread, and they actually hire Jack Kirby to do the artwork. Now, there's a couple of major Kirby characters that are not on the spread because Kirby hadn't created them and published them yet. But later in '66, you get the Silver Surfer, and then you also get the Black Panther. If you come to my Jack Kirby lecture at 5 o'clock today, I'll go into more detail about those two characters, but in the interest, of course, of time, I need to try to cover a lot more in this lecture, but I'll go into that more in depth in Kirby. Later on in the '60s, you get the first Marvel black superhero after the Black Panther, not created by Kirby. It's the Falcon, drawn by Gene Colan. You can see how finally the Falcon made the translation to live-action films, whether you like this or not. I wish their costumes were just a little more super-heroic, but that's a subject for a whole nother discussion. But there's the great Gene Colan, one of the few, Caucasian artists that could draw a fairly convincing black man. Most white artists never drew other races, and what you get as the '60s go on, just like in the rest of the culture, other races begin to creep into television and movies. You get that in comics, and you can see Colan's approach in his keynote character of the Silver Age, Iron Man. You can sense a man, the tragedy of a man trapped in an iron mask. There is the self-portrait of Colan that I ghosted behind the type there. He also did some pretty definitive versions in the Silver Age of the Submariner as well. On this page, I take out the original word balloons, and that's Colan telling you how influenced he was. Like all the Marvel artists, they were instructed by Lee to try to get the Kirby power dynamic into their work. And Colan talks about that, how Kirby's influence made Colan's work that much more dynamic, and it is really images like this that are really responsible for the success of the red and yellow suited Iron Man. His other key Silver Age Marvel character is Daredevil. In the text here, Colan talks about how he used photographs of acrobats and gymnasts so he can get across realistic movement. I think, just like the Green Lantern movie, we're all in agreement that the first Daredevil movie kind of sucked. I don't even like the costume, but it's a lot better than the costume they gave the Netflix Daredevil. Now, I haven't watched this one. People seem to like it, but I'm telling you, they can never get the costume right. And of course, every superhero, thanks to Dark Knight, has to have a 5 o'clock shadow. Give me the clean-shaven Daredevil and the superheroes of the day. Even Doctor Strange by Gene Colan shaved, you know what I mean? And he had a mustache. Now, after Ditko's Doctor Strange, those were pretty hard shoes to fill. I think it's only Colan's Doctor Strange with his pseudo-psychedelic layouts where people thought he was actually on drugs, but in my book I take out the original word balloons, and Colan talks about how, of course, that generation, they drank, they didn't do drugs, but people thought layouts like this were kind of psychedelic at the time. But who was Colan trying to imitate? This other Marvel Comics artist of the late Silver Age. This guy, maybe you know him, but he was so great that he actually made you have to turn the page around and read it to get across the story he was telling. That's the great Jim Steranko, whose two key figures for Marvel in the late Silver Age were both Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., and the ghosted image behind the type, Captain America. Younger people, again, are more familiar with this Nick Fury. They're more familiar with Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., maybe from the TV show. But how did Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. happen? Well, it was the James Bond craze of the mid-60s that infected all of pop culture. How did DC Comics react to it? Typically DC Comics Silver Age wacky Weisinger style with stupid covers like this. But how did Marvel react to it? Well, Jack Kirby said, you know, why don't we take our World War II character, Sergeant Fury, and why don't we bring him into 1965 and make him a secret agent? And that's how you get Nick Fury, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. But about a year later, Kirby's just doing the layouts. At the time, he was drawing a few books and laying out so many other books. All of a sudden, in December of '66, we see a signature at the bottom left corner of this cover. And we're going, first of all, who is Steranko and what is a Steranko? We never saw a name like that. Well, what was Steranko? He was an artist who took the Kirby dynamic and, if it was even possible, put it on steroids and came up with the Jim Steranko style, which is basically taking a lot of Kirby and amping it up to a whole nother level. And in this double-page spread, I tried to just get across in a graphic book form just the sheer intense energy and psychedelia of Steranko's imagery that to this day we're still staring at, trying to figure out how he did it. Look at this panel of Nick Fury in his slick Mad Men-like bachelor pad, and look how, you know, using a photograph as the city skyline, using a piece of op art to show how hip and, you know, relevant Nick Fury's apartment was. This was the doyenne of op art, Bridget Riley, taken from the 1965 op art exhibition, the Museum of Modern Art, and you can see how that affected Steranko's work just a couple years later on possibly not only one of his greatest covers of all time, but maybe one of the greatest covers in the history of comics. This appeared in June of 1968. At the same time, psychedelic artist Peter Max was doing images like this that the rest of the culture was going gaga over, but we comic book fans were getting our psychedelia in the comics via images like that and images like this by Steranko, who himself was influenced by the great magazine and poster illustrator Bob Peak, who in his early years was doing magazine illustration like this in the early and mid-'60s. Big influence on Steranko, as you can see here in this double-page spread in my book, of all of his famous white background covers. And look at what he did integrating type with image in that big boom at the top of the page. Captain America was his favorite character, and that's the image I used, ghosted behind the type. He only did 3 issues of Captain America in the late '60s, but amongst aficionados, they're still considered maybe the 3 greatest issues of Captain America ever that are still influential today. You can see how the British edition of Rolling Stone took that image for its cover in 1969. This is another Rolling Stone cover in the early 1971. So it was the Marvel Comics characters that were adopted by the rest of the pop culture. Here's the double-page spread from one of the newspapers, and look at the way the word comics is spelled, like the way they were spelling comics for underground comics, which were happening at the same time. Now you might ask, Arlen, where's all, how can you do the 60s without underground comics or Robert Crumb? Well, that's because there's not enough time. This is a whole nother lecture. But suffice it to say that while Robert Crumb was dropping acid and still being able to do pages and layouts like this, Jim Steranko was not dropping acid and doing pages like this. So both artists were doing psychedelic layouts just for different companies and different purposes. Meanwhile, an artist at DC Comics was looking at what Steranko was doing, and he was doing his own psychedelic layouts. This artist you might know as the great Neal Adams, who ended up becoming one of the greatest comic book artists of all time. His semi-photorealistic drawing style made the world of superheroes realistic and believable, like they've never been before. Being able to draw angles like this that no other comic artist ever even attempted before. Famous self-portrait from 1970. And in my book, I actually compare the effect that Steranko, who precedes Adams by just 1 or 2 years, and the effect that it had on, look at the use of Steranko's photograph in the lower left panel of the woman on the screen, and then a year later, what Neal Adams does with the image of the woman in the background there. In my book, I compare what Neal Adams did in comic strips in the early 60s with Ben Casey trying to get a human head in the middle of the 3 tiers there abstractly. And then when he goes to comics a couple of years later, he does the same kind of experiment with this character named Deadman. If you squint, you can see the image on the right-hand side as the image of Deadman's head. I'll be going into more of Neal Adams if you come to my Adams lecture tomorrow at 5 o'clock. I'll be going into the greatness of these images. But I remember being 10 years old, staring at that image for hours, wondering how the hell that pink image of Deadman got in the background. When he goes to Marvel in 1969, he does the same thing for his groundbreaking series of X-Men. It is this series of X-Men in 1969 and 1970 that is the foundation for the modern X-Men that came 5 years later, that every subsequent creator has been trying to imitate or do an homage to ever since. So without the Neal Adams X-Men, you would not be getting the cinematic X-Men, because you can go back to the images that Adams did at the tail end of the Silver Age and see the effect and the impact. Look in the lower right how I try to show the comparison between Adams' sketch and the finished ink panel by his partner Tom Palmer, the inker. When I ended up doing the Neal Adams sketchbook, that's all Adams' text, and even he considers the final art to be a failure, that he didn't accomplish what he felt he had in the sketch, but that's because of his standards. There's the cover of the Neal Adams sketchbook, and there is the title page that I really wanted to be the cover, but DC Comics, I think, wanted $40,000 licensing fee from the publisher, and they didn't want to pay that, so that's why I had to design the generic cover. But, I mean, that's a thumbnail sketch, and there's the finished 1969 full-page spread. This was the Neal Adams Batman that was the antidote to this Batman that we had to suffer through for a couple of years before. It was because Neal Adams, in creating images like this at the tail end of the Silver Age, by going back in history and resuscitating the original Dark Knight, the original Bob Kane drawn Batman with these giant bat wings, but drawing them realistically. And in 1968, in one single issue, he gives us the Dark Knight that we have today. There would be no Dark Knight if it wasn't for what Neal Adams did in 1968. And again, I'll be going into that more tomorrow. But that's because of images like that. And then in 1969, a year after he revamps Batman, he revamps Green Arrow. I'll never forget staring at that cover, because no superhero had facial hair. We remember Green Arrow looking like this generic DC Comics character drawn by Mike Sekowsky. Adams, though, knew his history, and he went back to the original pop culture conceptions of Green Arrow and gave us this Green Arrow that he was influenced by to create this costume, which we still see in use today in the popular Arrow TV show, which would then not be popular without Green Arrow. So by 1969, when this appeared, the rest of DC's superheroes were failing. Post-Vietnam War, we didn't want to see heroic heroes, it seemed, anymore. And the DC techno-heroes, as I call them, literally began to shrivel up, dry up, and die. Well, somebody at DC decided, you know what, your Green Arrow is very popular. Why don't we take the failing Green Lantern, team him up with Green Arrow, I guess because they're both green. And Neil Adams said, listen, if you're about to cancel Green Lantern, which they were, they said, give me a chance to pay my homage to Gil Kane. Let me draw this Green Lantern, Green Arrow. Because they felt Green Arrow was his character. So in 1970, we saw this cover. And inside that issue was this groundbreaking triptych of images. Remember I showed you that Gene Colan, black man? Well, this might be the first truly realistic drawing of a black man that Neil did not have photo reference for, like people thought. He drew that out of his head. But it was his photorealistic drawing style that made images like this still ring true today, because not many comic artists could pull that off like Neil Adams did. He would take, in the Green Lantern, Green Arrow series, images like this from the day and draw them into the stories. His partner, the writer Denny O'Neil, was able to write stories torn from the day's headlines because he had an artist like Neil Adams who drew realistically enough to pull these images off. 1971, they do the first drug story. I mean, Neil Adams said, you've got a character named Speedy. We've got a heroin epidemic. He drew this cover on spec, pitching it to DC and saying, forget comics code approval, you should just do this. And they did it. And it's considered legendary. Not that many artists can draw a teenager going through cold turkey. I mean, there's only a little bit of dialogue here, but it was Neil Adams' mastery of human emotion and anatomy that is able, I mean, if you're an artist, good luck trying to draw somebody biting on their hand as they're going through cold turkey. You've got to be able to know how to draw. But Neil's also a master cartoonist because he's able to also know when to get unrealistic and get psychedelic and get cartoony if the story calls for it. Covers like this that still affect me today when I look at them like they did when they first came out in '71. Neil was paying homage to his own Dead Man cover of a couple issues before, because no artist even took the time to draw realistic faces like that, and as many. Then he creates the first truly black superhero, John Stewart, who they wanted to make white in 1971. And Neil Adams basically stood up and said, you've got to be insane if you think the Guardians are going to come back 3 times to Earth and always select a white man. Forget about the fact that you haven't chosen a woman. I go, we should make Green Lantern black, not because we're liberals, but because it makes sense. And that's why you've got the success of today's John Stewart Green Lantern, because of what Neil Adams did. And like I said, here's the Guardians in 1959, white man. 1966, white man. And by the way, Denny O'Neil wanted to name him in the script, and I'm not making this up, Leroy Washington. And Neil Adams again said, you've got to be kidding me. And that's why he's John Stewart. In this double-page spread, you can see I give you a whole history of the black superhero on the left side there, but it was Neil Adams able to draw realistically like that panel in the upper left that makes dialogue from 1971 still ring true today, if you can read that dialogue in the upper left corner. And again, look at the dialogue if you can make it out in the upper right panel here. And that's because of Neil's mastery of human emotion like no other artist, even to this day, is able to get across like that. One incredible story has Green Arrow in a solo story stumbling upon a riot, and a young black kid goes to help him. You turn the page and you get this image. What makes Neil Adams a great artist is not only the realism to make you feel that bullet entering him, but it's his cartooning skills of knowing the lines, the force lines, the energy lines, because you feel that bullet without seeing it. Another artist might have drawn this image from behind to show you the bullet entering the head, but not Neil Adams. That's why he's a great artist. After that, you get this almost silent sequence. Elliot Maggin, his first published script, quotes Hemingway here, where it talks about how the world breaks gentle, innocent, kind people, and those that it does not break, it kills. It kills the very good, the very gentle, and the very brave impartially. And it's this image, the mixture of the xerography of the background. I mean, good luck trying to draw a man crying. Good luck trying to draw a man wearing a mask crying. But that is why this image became the portrait image in the chapter of my book. By the 13th issue, they decided to do their Christ analogy story based on the 1972 protests in Seattle that the SST would cause too much pollution, and they won. And that's why, since then, the SST has never flown in this country. So they decided to do a story based on that, torn from the day's headlines. Here's how I handled it in my book, The Double-Page Spread. There's a thumbnail sketch of that page. In real life, that's about 3 inches tall. And you can see everything in the finished drawing is in that thumbnail sketch. But you can see here, that's why I chose this image, which to me represented, coming out in 1972, the death of the counterculture, the death of the 60s dream. And that's why, in the end, the book is featured as the title page and the second title page, and it bookends my book. When you actually take the dust jacket off, this is the wraparound illustration underneath that I did, on the hopes that DC and Marvel would approve it legally. Very rare that they approve a joint character illustration, and they let me sign it. Now, I based it on one of the classic Neil Adams covers from the early 70s that he did, that everybody loves, influenced Alex Ross to do all those layouts. If you come in close, there's an image of Kurt Swan's Superman. He kind of ends my book. This image is from a pinup in 1966. This image is the first comic book cover I ever saw as a child. And I saw it when I was in summer camp. Here I am, about 6 years old. There it is on the floor by my feet there. The last page of my book is a one-page autobiography where I talk about the influence of the superheroes. You know, that's a postcard I sent back to my mother. I was 7 years old. You know, other kids are writing, send me candy, send me toys. I sent her a picture of Superman. I talk about how my father died when I was 4 months old, and my mother raised my brother and herself, and the superheroes became my surrogate father figures. That's my idea of Mount Rushmore, not the Republicans' idea of putting Ronald Reagan on. I'd like to see them do this. And the lower left corner, that's me in 8th grade doing an oral report with visual aids on the lawsuit between Superman and Captain Marvel, because the assignment was just do an information oral report on anything. Well, I always tried to get comics into whatever I was doing in school. But that's what I talk about here. Anyway, the last panel, back when I had a goatee, was, it ends with a quote that a friend of mine said, Arlen, this quote is you. And it was by Albert Camus, the great existentialist writer. And I remember it by heart. He said, a man's work is nothing but the slow trek to rediscover through the detours of art those 2 or 3 great and simple images in whose presence his heart first opened. Thank you. I just want to say this is the first of 4 lectures here I'll be doing at 5 o'clock. Later today I'll be doing Jack Kirby. Tomorrow, 5 p.m. in this room. Also Jack Kirby's in this room. I'll be doing Neil Adams. Again, the Jack Kirby lecture, there's some overlap, but plenty of other images. I go more in depth. I also run a Facebook group called Jack Kirby Company. Friend me and join. I run a group, thank you for that. I run a group based on Neil Adams called the Neil Adams Almanac. It's the 50th anniversary of his entrance into the comic book field, so in my lecture tomorrow I go into that in depth, just his first year, not even before he even does Batman. And then the next day, speaking of Batman, is the 25th anniversary of the greatest animated version of any comic character ever, when I do my take on the 25th anniversary of Batman. If you grab a card or come to my table or get my brochures, go to my website. My whole life is up there, all the work that I've done. You can click on it if you don't want to buy a copy here that I'll sign and sketch for you. You can go online, of course, and get a copy there. There's my Facebook group on the Silver Age. You know, I based these letters on the classic Marvel Mania letters, and Mark Evanier and Steve Sherman are here. They were the ones that put that together. So, excuse me. So even though I give Marvel equal time, I'm really a DC child, and it took me almost 40 years to finally design my own logo based on the DC Comics logo. So I want to thank them. I'm so glad we ran a little early. We've got, what, 5 minutes for a little Q&A, or no?
Yeah, sure.
Any?
Yes.
You tell me.
Yeah.
Good. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Today, Schumer, so passionate about your work, and it's just fantastic. A quick question, I hope the answer is yes. Are all the images, primarily most of the images that you showed us today, contained in your book?
Most of them, absolutely. Yeah, not all of them, most of them. You know, the original proposal was for a 300-page book. My agent at the time laughed at me. She said, Arlen, nobody's going to pay for a 300-page full color. It would be too expensive. Well, anyway, the point is the hardest creative job I had on my book was editing it down from 300 pages to like 196. But that means every single page in my book counts. There is not a single wasted millimeter of space. So trust me, if you remember the Captain Marvel in the upper left corner, if one little factoid is stuck in the upper left corner of one page, imagine the wealth of information and knowledge and passion that awaits you on literally every page of my book. But thank you for that compliment. Anybody else? Yes, Jim.
If you had room in your book for one more person, would it have been Wally Wood?
You know, part of what he's saying is how come there aren't more. Murphy Anderson stopped talking to me. I used to have a relation with him, but he resented the fact that I didn't give him a chapter. People who love John Romita, where's the John Romita? You know, again, if I had 300 pages, they all would have been represented with chapters. But I had to make, you know, it's like if you've ever been married and you had to fight over the wedding list of who gets in and who makes the A-list, and even though you have some best friends that didn't quite make the A-list, everybody, before they got married, has to knock down, drag out fight with who's ever paying for the wedding, right? You remember those days. You, right there. You, I'm talking to you. Yeah, you remember. You had to fight before the wedding of who's on the A-list. It's the same thing. So I had a criteria. The reason why Gene Colan made it in, he only had 8 pages, but he said, Arlen, those 8 pages were the best things ever done on my work. He made it in over Kurt Swan. Why? Because A, I needed to balance out the book, Marvel and DC. I needed more Marvel artists. B, Colan did 3 characters. Yes, Kurt Swan drew the whole Superman family, but in a sense, it was just Superman. Just Superman. But yes, Kurt Swan deserves a chapter. Murphy Anderson, but I couldn't do it for everybody. Murphy Anderson didn't make it in because I rationalized, well, every image in the Infantino chapter is inked by Murphy Anderson. But again, he stopped talking to me, which hurt me because I didn't give him his own chapter. So what can I tell you? You can't please everybody all the time, but I did my best. And the bottom line is, I'm still fielding questions in my group about why didn't you include this or why didn't you include that. You know, cut me some slack. You know, what can I tell you? We have limitations. Anybody else? Yes?
Or the plans for a sequel.
Yeah, volume 2.
Plans for a sequel. Volume 2 or 3.
I'm waiting for a publisher to pay me to do one. God forbid, like, you know, I'm still waiting for that phone call, but that hasn't happened. But believe me, people want it, and I'm a freelance, you know, I'm a freelance artist. I just can't do it all on my own again. I've got my own projects that I'm doing for no money, you know, as self-starter projects. So that's the problem, is that I'd love to do it. I'd like to do a book on the 70s, and Kaluta and Wrightson and Jim Aparo. Are you kidding me? I can do the same kind of book. But I just can't do it on my own. I got bills to pay, etc. So, you know, but believe me, if a publisher's out there and says, Arlen, I love your book, we'll pay you to do another one, I'm available for that. One more question? Yes?
Were there changes in print technology as time went along that allowed them to expand their art style? So it
Allowed them to expand what?
allowed them to explore different art styles. The better use of color or...
Well, that's happened since the Silver Age.
Okay.
You know, you look back at those, I still like the original newsprint. I don't like the reprints. I like the newsprint coloring. But yeah, I mean, the irony is that like Neil Adams was one of the best newsprint colorists, and yet I believe he's one of the worst computer colorists. How could the same artist that had such great sense for newsprint coloring, which had to be more simpler and more designy when it's done well. Computer coloring, you have so many choices. I find Neil's computer coloring over-rendered and muddy. Yet I praise his newsprint coloring, so it's a little disconcerting, but that's technology. It has its benefits and it has it's a tool. And you've got to use the tool to make things better, not worse. But as you know, sometimes the opposite happens. Should we wrap it up? I think that's it. Thank you so much. Come to my table. I'll be selling books today. 5 o'clock back here for Jack Curry. Thank you.